Hallo zusammen. Pascal hier.
Hello everyone, Pascal here from Neutrality Studies. Today I'm speaking for the second time with Mr. Ulrich Heyden. Mr. Heyden is a journalist, author, and long-time Moscow correspondent for various German newspapers. Ulrich, welcome back.
Good day, hello Pascal.
Leider müssen wir mit einem sehr unschönen Thema anfangen.
Unfortunately, we have to start with a rather unpleasant topic, something personal. A few days ago, or maybe at the end of last week, you found out that your bank in Germany is closing your accounts. Could you tell us a bit about that? Explain what happened. This so-called debanking already seems like a kind of preview of possible sanctions against you as a German journalist in Russia.
Für dich als Journalisten, deutschen Journalisten in Russland.
Yeah, that really shocked me. It was on Friday last week, March 13th. I mean, I kind of expected it, or at least the thought had been floating around in my head that something like this could happen. Back in December 2023, the bank had already said it could no longer make online transfers to Russia. They said it just wasn't possible. They claimed they were a regional bank, which is honestly pretty ridiculous, because Hamburg is an international trading hub, with lots of foreigners living there and plenty of business going on. So saying you're a regional bank and therefore can't have a business relationship with a German living in Russia, that's just, well. Anyway, I had to improvise a bit to get access to my money.
An mein Geld ranzukommen. Irgendwie klappte das dann mit viel Zeitaufwand.
Somehow it worked out in the end, though it took a lot of time. But now I have to improvise again. So there are really two issues here. One is the account itself, and the other is how to transfer money from that account to Russia. All right, when it comes to the account, they were very reluctant to put in writing, clearly in black and white, why they were actually doing this. There's a general explanation in the termination letter. It says, we're reviewing all business relationships with customers who live in Russia and will be ending them. Okay. And then over the phone, an employee said that it had to do with the Russia sanctions. But all of that is kind of vague, nothing really in black and white. And then he said on the phone, the bank employee said on the phone, so, where are you registered? I said, in Russia. Then he said, well, if you were to register in Germany now, maybe we could still stop the account closure. I told him that's not possible because I live in Russia for more than half the year. So it was really strange whether they actually meant it seriously, trying to lure me out of Russia with that kind of offer, like, you could keep your account then. Just very strange.
That's the kind of thinking you get from bureaucrats. The gentleman on the other end of the line simply knew that if you were registered in Germany as a taxpayer, then they could fill out the form, send it in, stamp it, and that would be that. But what that actually means for you personally, that of course isn't clear to him.
Was das für dich persönlich bedeutet, ist dem Herrn natürlich nicht klar.
I also assume that the employees who deal with me personally probably don't have anything against me. He also hinted that the federal financial regulator was putting pressure on them. That was an interesting remark, because he basically suggested that the bank might actually want to distance itself from all this, but they have to go through with it anyway. And
sogar davon distanziert, aber sie müssen es eben machen, ne? Und
entweder wir haben es hier mit vorauseilendem Gehorsam.
Either your bank is just showing some kind of preemptive obedience, saying, oh no, we have to cut off all business with Russia now, even for German citizens living there. No more private banking, because it might cause trouble later. Or, someone actually called and said, we want you to stop that, coming from an official source. But of course, nothing like that would ever be made public. So it has to be one of those two, most likely.
he also said that Russia is a non-tax country. Honestly, I have no idea what that's supposed to mean. Maybe, if you try to follow the bank's logic, you could think, well, there are no longer any legal or official relations between Russia and Germany. So maybe that means anti-money laundering measures can't be coordinated anymore or something like that. But come on. They've already forbidden me from transferring money to Russia. Money laundering can't even happen if I can't make that transfer in the first place. So this is really just about the physical presence of money in an account here in Germany. It stays in Germany, and that's their area of responsibility, under their control. Very strange, all of it.
It's simply yet another act of harassment against private individuals, and especially against journalists. We don't know whether it's coming from an official source or if it's a case of a German bank showing preemptive obedience. But either way, it just adds to this ongoing harassment.
Yes, exactly. I see it the same way. And then I decided to take action, because I just can't accept that. In my area of responsibility, I want to do everything I can to oppose it. So I wrote a letter to the federal president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, where I briefly described my situation and said I hope he'll respond. I don't know if he'll help me. The chances aren't very high, but at least I wanted to try.
All right, you try everything you can. It's just sad right now that this whole issue of sanctions, of sanctioning, well, luckily you're not officially sanctioned, but the screws keep getting tightened, and any kind of interaction, even between private individuals in Germany and Russia, is being blocked more and more. And especially because you're a journalist, it hits you even harder. You're still reporting from Moscow, writing for the Nachdenkseiten and other outlets. So yeah, they're really making life even harder for you here.
Man macht dir hier das Leben wirklich noch schwieriger. Gut, wir werden natürlich an der Sache dranbleiben.
All right, we'll definitely keep following this story, and if something happens, please let us know. But what we really want to talk about today is the Donbas Republic. You've got many years of experience, not just in Moscow, but also in Ukraine, in the Donbas region. And that's what we wanted to discuss. So, where do you think we should start the story of the Donbas? Not back in the Middle Ages, but in a way that helps us understand the conflict and the situation today. Where does the story begin?
Wo beginnt die Geschichte?
Well, from a really hardline Russian point of view, you could start back in 1918 when there was already a Donbas Republic. That was during the time of the Ukrainian Civil War. And the Donbas has always been, you could say, largely settled by Russians because it was an industrial region built up for the Russian Empire. There was a lot of coal there, and then they put the steel plants in as well. So there was, in a sense, a Red Donbas Republic that was founded back then. But Lenin said, no, we want to attach the Donbas to the Socialist Ukrainian Soviet Republic. The Soviet leadership probably had the idea that they could enrich the mostly rural Ukraine by adding a more proletarian, Bolshevik part from the Donbas region. Vladimir Putin got very upset about that and said the Bolsheviks had basically betrayed Russian interests. That also led to a situation where the Ukrainian language was, so to speak, given preference over Russian. In a way, Russians were discriminated against by this artificial creation of the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic. So there was this kind of positive discrimination against Russians in favor of Ukrainian culture and language. And that's actually true. At least as far as I can tell, there's some truth to it. And in the conflict with Ukraine, it's historically interesting that not only the Donbas was added to Ukraine, but also other regions, like Crimea, which Khrushchev transferred in 1954, and then Western Ukraine, which actually belonged to Poland until 1939. And all these territories are now being fiercely defended by Ukrainian nationalists, as if they were historically and originally Ukrainian lands. which is quite obviously not the case.
Was ganz offensichtlich nicht stimmt. Aber es ist im Prinzip ja jetzt egal. Also was den heutigen
But at this point, it doesn't really matter anymore. When it comes to the current conflict, it actually began in 2014 with the coup in Kyiv. That immediately triggered a protest movement in the southeast of Ukraine. It spread from Kharkiv through Donetsk and Luhansk all the way to Odessa. There were demonstrations by ethnic Russians, even waving Russian flags, calling for friendship with Russia and for continued economic ties with Russia. In Kharkiv, there was even a congress at the end of February, bringing together deputies from southeastern Ukraine, where President Yanukovych was still supposed to speak, before he was illegally driven out of Kyiv.
Illegalerweise da vertrieben wurde aus Kiew. Aber dieser Kongress hat dann doch keine Wirkung.
But that Congress didn't really have any effect, because the Ukrainian coup government moved in with assault units, militant pro-Maidan squads. There were fights over the regional administration building in Kharkiv. First it was occupied, then it was retaken by pro-Maidan fighters. Something similar happened in Odessa, where protesters had taken refuge in the trade union building after an attack on a tent camp. They were attacked there, and the building was set on fire. That was meant as a show of force to intimidate the entire protest movement. And the only ones who really took part in this so-called Russian Spring, because it was, in a way, a kind of Russian awakening in southeastern Ukraine, well, it wasn't necessarily about joining Russia. At first, it was really more about trying to gain a certain degree of autonomy and to protect the Russian language and Russian culture. People didn't want to be forced into Ukrainization, which had already been happening since around 2005. For example, universities and schools in southeastern Ukraine were required to switch to Ukrainian as the main language, and that put people under pressure because it simply wasn't their native language. And then, of course, there were the occupations in Donetsk and Luhansk by activists, unarmed, but still acts of civil disobedience. Administrative buildings were occupied, including in Luhansk, even the intelligence service building. That was in March and April of 2014. Then the government in Kyiv, under Turchinov, who was the acting president of Ukraine at the time, launched an anti-terror operation on April 13th. Troops were sent to the southeast of Ukraine, to Luhansk and Donetsk. Airstrikes began. There were attacks and fighting around the airports there, and the images from that time are really striking. You can see Ukrainian armored vehicles with soldiers sitting on top and civilians trying to stop those vehicles with their bare hands. So that was basically in April 2014, meaning at that point it was still a real conflict within one nation, the Ukrainian state. A civil war. Yes, a civil war. And that's something the German and Western media have completely forgotten. They no longer recognize that the people in the Donbas who took to the barricades, who held big rallies, as I said, waving Russian flags and all that, did so because they felt they were being pushed aside. A nationalist government from Western Ukraine was being put in front of them, one with a completely different view of history. For them, May 9th is no longer the day celebrating victory over Hitler's fascism. They don't even want to celebrate Russian Orthodox Christmas anymore. They wanted that, yes, and you could see it too. All the monuments were taken down, the Soviet and Russian ones. The Russian language was restricted, so all those fears actually came true. Now, occupying a building is of course a very radical step, but that kind of action had already happened in Kyiv on November 30th, 2013. There was a confrontation between students and the police, and after that, things suddenly became more radical. The Maidan movement turned into something you could really call militant. At least there was a strong, militant right-wing nationalist faction, and they went on to occupy as many as 13 government buildings in Kyiv. So when people now say that the Russian-speaking population in Donbas started the violence, that's completely wrong. The violence began with the occupation of government buildings in Kiev.
Mit der Besetzung von Regierungsgebäuden in Kiew. Und
Entschuldigung, das ist, glaube ich, ein ganz, ganz wichtiger
Sorry, I think that's a really, really important point. Because the question is, how did all this develop? The thing is, it's not just that Viktor Yanukovych was largely supported by people from the east. He was elected with, I think, over 80% of the vote from the east and from the Donbas, and in the end also from Crimea. And then, in February 2014, this president with an eastern orientation was basically driven out. But there was already a precedent set back in November, when those protesters who didn't like the government simply occupied buildings. And then people in the Donbas said, well, we'll just do the same thing here, because here we're the majority, and now we'll take things into our own hands. And that's how it kind of built up naturally from within, because one side learned from the other.
ganz natürlich aufgeschaukelt hat, weil einer vom anderen lernt.
Also ich meine, diese Donbass-Leute sind eigentlich absolut friedlich.
I mean, the people in Donbass are actually really peaceful folks.
Was habt ihr
So if you ask them, what happened back in 2014, how did it all start? They'll tell you, well, in Kiev they were out protesting and we were working. You heard that from everyone.
Das sind richtige, sag ich mal,
So these are genuinely hardworking people, I'd say.
aber das war auch das Verrückte.
But that's also what was so strange. I was there, and they were showing these big videos on screens about the mafia in Donbass and about the, well, sure, there was mafia everywhere in Ukraine.
Aber ich meine,
But what I mean is, these Donbass people were mocked and insulted by those nationalists called vatniki, basically pro-Russian types or mafia.
also beschimpft und also lächerlich gemacht und also es fehlte von Anfang an auf dem Maidan überhaupt.
What was missing from the very beginning on the Maidan was this: let's really be one nation. Let's talk to each other. Instead, there was this aggressive, arrogant attitude. We're the ones who want to go to Europe. We're better than the rest. Basically, we don't want anything to do with those backward people in the Donbass. And that mindset was practically adopted by West German politicians. Because, and I watched this very closely back in 2013 and 2014 during the Maidan, not a single European politician visited the Donbass, or Luhansk, or Crimea. Not one. Even though at that time, all of them were still Ukrainian citizens. So how can you hand out bread rolls on the Maidan and boast about it?
Also Brötchen verteilen und sich rühmen, später wir haben 5 Milliarden für den Staats.
Later on, we provided $5 billion for the coup in Ukraine. At least that's how Nuland proudly described it. But from the very beginning, it was done over the heads of the people of Ukraine, who were largely Russian-speaking and culturally connected to Russia. And the fact that this isn't even mentioned in the German media is frankly criminal. They just tell a story that's all about Western Ukraine, which is really only a small part of the country. Because in Ukraine, there are many different shades of relationships with the West. That influence is stronger, of course, in the west of the country, while central and southeastern Ukraine lean more toward Russia.
Die mittlere Ukraine, die Südostukraine, die stärker zu Russland tendiert. Also unvorstellbar.
Das ist ja das Wahnsinnige an dem ganzen Narrativ.
What's really crazy about this whole narrative is when you hear people in Europe, in Germany, in Switzerland, and so on say, we have to support the Ukrainians. We have to help the Ukrainian people. And then you ask, okay, but which ones exactly? Why not those from the east? They actually don't want to be part of Russia either, and now they're under occupation. And then you ask people, so why have roughly more than 3 million Ukrainians actually fled to Russia? That's something that also needs to be explained. And that's when people in Europe start getting angry.
Und dann werden die Leute schon wütend in Europa. Weil dann merken sie, dass man nicht mit ihnen einverstanden ist.
Because then they realize you don't agree with them. This whole narrative that all of Ukraine, every Ukrainian, wants freedom from Russia, and that Russia just paid off 2 or 3 mobsters and then invaded. That's not how it was. In the Donbas, it's, well, our own narrative says there were just a few warlords. And Russia gave them money, then sent in its own troops, and together they occupied everything, and now keep the population there under an iron fist. That's more or less how it's told here. But honestly, that's just cheap nonsense, isn't it?
Das ist einfach billiger Quatsch, oder?
Ja, vor allen Dingen ist es ja so, sie könnten, wenn sie sagen, also die russische...
Well, above all, the thing is this. They could say, like even Steinmeier said, that the Russians had actually sent troops in 2014. But there isn't a single photo, not one video, showing Russian troops or Russian armed forces. Nothing. The only thing that exists is a public statement from Putin and his spokesman Peskov, acknowledging that many thousands of Russians followed, as they say in Russia, the call of their hearts, and went to the Donbass to support the Russians there. I mean, there are also Germans who go to Ukraine and fight on the side of the Ukrainian government.
Auf Seiten der ukrainischen Regierung, also da hat man nichts dagegen, aber
Well, there's nothing wrong with that. But, alright, first of all, it's simply a fact that there's no proof Russia was militarily active there at all. I'm sure Russia had advisors on the ground who also worked with the insurgents, especially when the so-called People's Republic was set up, to bring a bit of order into things. Because in those People's Republics, for example, there were a lot of battalions controlling their own areas, and the situation was completely unclear. Within the Donetsk Republic, there were several small territories, and it's still unclear why the People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk didn't just merge right from the start.
Lugansk und Donetsk, warum die nicht gleich zusammengegangen sind. Also es waren auch, mal sagen, ja, starke...
There were also strong fragmentations, and I think Russian advisors certainly played a role in that. Maybe even military advisors were actually active there. But the people I met in Luhansk and so on always told me all the weapons we have here we captured from the Ukrainians. And all those Russia haters never showed a single photo of Russian troops in Ukraine, at least not before 2022. So they simply weren't there. I mean, there was no need for them to be there, because Russia wasn't interested in showing off militarily. Russia's real goal was for the Donbas to gain a certain level of autonomy, to protect the Russian language, and so on, within Ukraine.
Schutz der russischen Sprache und so weiter innerhalb der Ukraine. Das hat Russland ja praktisch bis
And Russia basically kept that up until 2022. I was there myself. I talked to the volunteers. They were sitting in the trenches in Donetsk and on the outskirts of the city, and they told me, "We're being shelled all the time. We want to fire back, but we're not allowed to." That really frustrated them. There are also a lot of people now who say they're angry at Russia for not having moved in earlier. Many Russians in that region are disappointed about that. You only learn about these kinds of details when you're actually there on the ground.
Interessanten Details, die erfährt man natürlich nur, wenn man dort vor Ort ist.
You only learn the details on the ground, but the overall picture should actually be fairly clear, because those two people's republics had already declared their independence. That was sometime in the summer or fall of 2014.
In May 2014.
Im Mai bereits. Im Mai haben sie ihre Unabhängigkeit erklärt und bis Februar 22 hat Russland diese...
Until February 2022, Russia hadn't recognized those declarations of independence. Russia never said, "Yes, you're independent, we support you," or anything like that. No, the whole strategy was always to keep the Donbass within Ukraine. That was the entire framework of the Minsk agreements, both 1 and 2, that the Donbass would remain part of Ukraine.
From the very beginning, that was basically Russia's hope. If they could use political pressure to make the Donbass region gain autonomy, then Ukraine would, in effect, become what they actually wanted, a neutral state. Because if the Donbass had a voice in Ukraine's parliament, all those excesses that later happened wouldn't have been possible. It would have caused an international scandal if a country with an autonomous region had treated that region the way it was treated. But now the area is cut off, isolated, and covered by a kind of silence. You hardly hear anything about what's happening in the Donbass anymore. That's actually very unfavorable for Russia, because now it's only Russian media reporting on it. Western journalists hardly ever go there anymore.
Ja. Also eben die ganze Strategie aus russischer Seite hin war eigentlich
Well, the whole strategy from the Russian side was basically about institutional neutralization, keeping Ukraine neutral. The idea was that Ukraine wouldn't become a NATO member, but it also wouldn't be pulled into the Russian sphere. So it wouldn't turn into a second Belarus. It would stay where it was, with the Donbas acting as a counterweight to Western Ukraine. And that way you could maintain a stable environment. And that almost worked. If it hadn't been for the Maidan. If the Maidan hadn't gone further. If that whole build-up hadn't happened. And if the Minsk agreements hadn't been constantly undermined. In my view, that's also why Putin agreed to it. Because it could have been a workable solution for a tolerable neighborhood. Or how do you see it?
Akzeptable Nachbarschaft. Oder wie siehst du das?
Doch, also ich meine, das war.
Well, I mean, the Russians basically pursued a defensive policy. They tried to do everything they could on the diplomatic level to protect their own security. And protecting their security means that Ukraine shouldn't become a NATO member, and that, let's say, no Nazi groups, meaning extremely anti-Russian groups, come to power there. That could have been prevented if the Donbass had really been integrated into the Ukrainian state with its own autonomy.
Mit seiner Autonomie in das ukrainische Staatswesen. Ja, also. Und.
Well, you know, I mean, this generosity from Putin, let's be honest, it wasn't rewarded at all. I mean, I've said this before. There are even Russians who say he's far too gentle, far too patient, and so on. But that's another topic. It's tragic, really. I was actually there in the region most recently in January, in Mariupol. And I've basically been in the Donbass every year, ever since 2014. For me, it's almost like a kind of home. When I walk through Donetsk, I know the streets there, and it's a strange feeling. You feel connected to the place. Of course, I try to stay objective, to keep a clear, factual view of things. But you somehow become part of this conflict. And at times, it's really painful. I mean, I remember situations like this. Back in 2015, in Donetsk, and the kids there told me, all excited and proud, that they could already identify the shells flying over the city or exploding somewhere nearby, what kind of shell it was, where it came from. Unbelievable, really. And now, we're in a situation where 12-year-olds, who were born in 2014, the year of the Civil War, the year of the coup, are now 12 years old and basically know nothing but war. And that's really terrible, and actually a crime of the West, that these children, who were born and raised in war and know nothing else, are basically unknown to us. When people report on children from Ukraine, it's always kids from central Ukraine, but never from the Donbas. And well, I mean, the humanitarian principles that Europe claims to stand for are being violated. And it's even worse now, because in Germany, there's an active effort to discriminate against and even criminalize humanitarian aid. There are basically arrest warrants out for members of the humanitarian organization Peace Bridge Donbass. 2 of them now live in Moscow, but German media keep running these kinds of campaigns. A state security unit searched apartments in Brandenburg and Berlin, but they didn't find the people. It had long been known that they were already living in Moscow, that they had emigrated because they were afraid to keep living in Germany. And then they start forcing this narrative that humanitarian aid isn't really humanitarian aid at all, but supposedly covert deliveries of spare parts that could also be used for military purposes. So this keeps getting brought up again and again, almost obsessively. But what are the Western humanitarian organizations themselves actually doing when they criminalize the Peace Bridge Donbass and later label any aid to the Donbass as support for terrorism, which is really unimaginable? Then at least they could say, yes, we've sent our own people, we've sent the Red Cross, we've done this or that. But that's not the case. As far as I know, the Red Cross isn't present there, and neither are any other German aid organizations.
Es ist schlicht und ergreifend diese Kriegsmentalität.
It's simply this war mentality that treats any kind of help for the enemy as something terrible, almost like an act of betrayal.
Also auch für die Kinder.
For the children, so for the civilians, that's supposedly considered military too, and so on.
Militärisch und also
Es ist eine ganz schlimme Entwicklung, in der sich
It's really quite simple. Europe is going through a very troubling development right now, and unfortunately, Germany is leading the way. This totalization of effort, this attitude of we have to win, is something that always happens in wartime. And sadly, in Western Europe, it turns into complete ideologization, meaning people stop making distinctions, and everything becomes about opposing the enemy, even involving the civilian population in that logic. We can see it right now, with Iran, for example, when Chancellor Merz justifies the American and Israeli attacks on Iran by saying that Iran has also violated international law. So now, apparently, it's fair game to attack them.
Internationales Recht gebrochen hat, also jetzt angegriffen werden darf. Also diese Logik, die zieht.
And that logic, unfortunately, runs all the way through, even when it comes to humanitarian aid in war zones. What else should we keep in mind when we talk about the Donbas? Well, something that, thankfully, many people are aware of, maybe not on the other side, but on our side of the narrative, is that between 2014 and 2022, 14,000 people lost their lives in the Donbas, under shelling from Western Ukraine. I mean, those are enormous. Well, that's not entirely correct.
Ja, das ist nicht ganz richtig. Also, soweit ich weiß, diese Zahl 14.000 bezieht sich.
As far as I know, that number, 14,000, refers to the Donbas. The Donbas is a region, meaning Luhansk and Donetsk are part of it. And back in 2014, only about 2/3 of that area came under the control of the so-called People's Republics. Roughly 1/3 remained Ukrainian, you could say. So when the UN talks about 14,000, they're also referring to the victims in the Ukrainian part of the Donbas. But honestly, that doesn't really matter. A civil war is a civil war. People die on both sides. The real question is, why did it come to a civil war in the first place? We've talked about that. The real scandal, in my view, is that these 14,000 deaths have completely disappeared from Western media coverage since 2022, because those 14,000 deaths prove there was already a war going on. 14,000 people had already died. But that doesn't fit the story. The story has to be repeated every day that Russia started the war in 2022.
Man muss ja unbedingt täglich wiederholen, dass Russland den Krieg angefangen hat mit der Invasion
War
in die Ukraine.
2022.
Ja.
Unprovoziert einmarschiert 2022.
Unprovoked invasion in 2022. The unprovoked war. But I've already talked about this with Patrick Barb. For me, I find this war easiest to understand when you break it down into 3 different conflicts that are happening at the same time. First, there's the civil war in the Donbas, which began back in 2014. Then there's the interstate war between Russia and Ukraine, where the fighting is happening right now. And on top of that, of course, there's the great power conflict between NATO and Russia, which obviously plays a crucial role in all of this.
Der auch natürlich ganz essentiell dort hineinspielt. Und die 3 sind ineinander natürlich vermischt.
And those 3 are of course all mixed together. But they're really 3 different conflicts, with different causes and in part different actors who aren't necessarily involved on every level. The civil war and the great power conflict, for example, are, I think, quite far apart, though they obviously influence each other. Patrick Barb says there are actually 5 different conflicts. So, how do you think we should best break down the current situation?
Die momentane Situation am besten auseinanderbröseln.
Also man müsste eigentlich ja die Krim auf jeden Fall. Die Krim hat ja auch noch mehr ihre eigene Geschichte.
Well, you really have to start with Crimea. Crimea has its own history. The referendum, when was that? In March 2014. And then in May 2014, the referendums in Luhansk and Donetsk. The new Russian regions came later in 2022. In Russia, they call them the new Russian territories. That's Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. And they joined Russia through referendums in 2022 as well. So yes, I think the most important thing for us as critical journalists is to keep reminding people how those so-called People's Republics came into being, and to keep explaining it again and again. Because that's really the key evidence showing that the war in Ukraine isn't Russia's fault, but in the end, a reaction to the coup.
Eine Reaktion ist auf den Staatsstreich.
And you really have to keep retelling this drive for independence in the Donbas republics over and over again. There are films about it, some very good ones. Mark Barthine-May made the first film. Wilhelm Dunke-Schulz made films too, and many others. I recently went to a film festival in Moscow organized by RT, where a lot of Donbass films were shown. There's one very good film, actually an outstanding documentary, called On the Edge of the Abyss by Maxim Fadiev. He's actually a designer who started filming back in 2014. He's from Sloviansk, so from the Donbass region itself, and he used a high-quality camera to film the Somali battalion, which was a volunteer unit. He literally put himself in danger every day, from morning till night.
Täglich, also von morgens bis abends in Gefahr begeben. Dieses Bataillon ist komplett.
That battalion is gone. Everyone in it is dead. And in his film, he shows how those people at the Azov steel plant tried to drive out the Azov battalion from the residential buildings where they had dug in. The film really says a lot about a kind of patriotism we don't even know, the patriotism of the people in the Donbas. They're willing to fight, not for something made up, but for their cultural values, for their Russian language, for what matters to them, maybe even for their faith, their Russian Orthodox faith. And you actually see these soldiers, how they eat, how they sleep, how they talk to each other, how they use their radio phones to communicate and gather information. So it's absolutely not some kind of dramatic or militaristic spectacle. It's a real documentary that puts you right in the middle of what's happening. The film itself is interesting. It's having a hard time gaining attention in Russia because there's a lot of speculation about it. Why is that so difficult? Well, the film is now available in the media library of the main Russian TV channel. It has a total of 4 episodes, each about 2 hours long.
Der hat insgesamt 4 Folgen, jeweils 2 Stunden, also ein riesiges Werk.
It's a huge production, but movie theaters in Russia aren't really eager to show it. They don't give it good placement. And the director, Maxim Fadiev, said during a panel discussion that this just isn't acceptable. He pointed out that during World War II, what Russians call the Great Patriotic War, there were, for example, about 20 cameramen covering the liberation of Budapest. And now in Pokrovsk, in Ukraine, there are only 1 or 2. To me, that clearly shows there are people in Russian society who believe there's far too little patriotic education or awareness being promoted.
Patriotische Aufklärung betrieben wird und Russland, aber die russische Führung
Russia. But I don't think the Russian leadership wants that, wants those kinds of films to be put front and center. Because that could stir up very strong emotions. I mean, when Russians see that these are young guys, 25, 30, 35 years old, none of them older than 40, and they see how they fight, that's something deeply moving for any Russian. And then they all die. And that raises the question, are we, as the nation of Russia, really doing enough in this conflict? Have we really pushed our interests firmly enough there? Now, this might sound crazy to a lot of Europeans, but we have to look at Russia the way it actually is. And there are a lot of different shades to that. There are people who might even be against the war, but there are also those who believe we need to support the so-called People's Republics and these new territories much more strongly. And some think we should take a tougher stance against Ukraine. So that view exists too.
Also diese Meinung gibt es auch.
Yeah, no. The thing with that movie probably has to do with the fact that any war film where the soldiers don't heroically win in the end, don't plant the flag on the mountain and say we conquered it, but instead shows people dying. Any war film like that automatically becomes an anti-war film, because it really shows the terror and the horror of war. And that, of course, stirs up fear of war itself. And that's often something people don't want to see while a war is still going on. Afterwards, that changes. You can even see that in Germany. All those anti-war movies about how German soldiers died in World War II were meant to show just how terrible it was. And it really was absolutely terrible. But during a war, people usually don't want to show how their own soldiers are dying. It's sad, but that war mentality exists on both sides. And this spiral of war, what we're seeing in Germany, is that part of the story is being completely left out. The suffering in the Donbas, the isolation of the Donbas, that whole part is being ignored. And in reality, Ukraine wants the Donbas, but not the people who live there. That's what people are inviting, in a way.
We also have to say, it's not just the suffering in the Donbas, but also the suffering of Ukrainian men who are being picked up off the streets, the suffering of Ukrainian Democrats whose parties have been banned, of journalists who are sitting in prison. There are thousands of Ukrainians who are imprisoned there. Take Ruslan Kozaba, for example, a well-known pacifist who now lives in New York, because if he had stayed, he would have been charged with treason. So,
there are so many videos out there, and some are unbelievably brutal. One that I'll probably never forget, and honestly I shouldn't have watched it at all, shows 2 Ukrainian soldiers on the battlefield, trying to surrender to the Russians, their hands raised, and then they're shot from behind, by their own Ukrainian side. It's unbelievable, the level of brutality going on there. That's why, really, the entire effort of the Europeans should be to end this war as quickly as possible through diplomacy. But the fact that this hasn't happened for 4 years now, and instead Ukraine keeps getting flooded with weapons, just to sacrifice even more Ukrainians at the front, that, to me, is a huge crime. But unfortunately, not for the majority of Europeans.
yeah, I mean, you really have to take a closer look at what, for example, Christoph Vonner, the Welt correspondent in Kiev, is saying. He sometimes says some pretty interesting things. Of course, he's basically fully aligned with official German policy. But every now and then, he says things that are actually useful for us, things worth publishing even. For instance, he said he used to think that Russification was just Russian propaganda. But then he saw it himself in Kiev, and it was truly awful. I mean, that's quite a statement coming from a regular liberal, let's say a European liberal, whose views should, in principle, be broadly accepted across Europe. Or he said he'd seen that 70,000, or maybe even more, people have already returned from Ukraine to Mariupol.
Aus der Ukraine nach Mariupol, also in das Mariupol, was die Russen sozusagen sich genommen haben.
In Mariupol, the city the Russians basically took, Ukrainians are actually returning voluntarily because they love that city, because it's their hometown. That doesn't really fit the usual narrative, right? The one that says everyone who could possibly flee from Mariupol did so. I was there myself and saw how the city has been rebuilt, about 90% of it. The university, a fantastic building, and even the destroyed theater, they're back. And I asked there, I said, so how is it at the university? I asked the rectors. In Germany, people say all the normal Ukrainians have left the city. And she said, no, why would you say that? The real patriots stayed. We're the teaching staff of a university. These are all people who studied here at the university in Mariupol and now work here as law professors and so on. And while the Russians have, it's kind of funny, the people I talked to there kept saying, whenever something new was built, yeah, the Russians built that. The Russians built that. Even though they themselves were already Russians, they'd gotten Russian passports too. And while the university had this really modern, multimedia center, a dance and theater hall, and a huge concert hall. The building had been almost completely destroyed. The Azov battalion had holed up in the basement, and there was fighting over it. So they were really happy that everything was up and running again.
Die waren jetzt sehr froh, dass das alles wieder in Gang war. Ich habe das auch gesehen, die Studenten gingen da ein und aus.
I saw that too. Students were going in and out all the time. There was even a room for a psychologist who gave a report. She said she'd asked, "Are people coming here because of war trauma or something like that?" And the answer was, "No, why? We're dealing with the usual problems young people have." So they were really trying to bring everyday life back to normal, to get things running again, which wasn't easy at all. The rector told me that in 2022, there was a moment when many people were genuinely uncertain. Should they leave the city? Should they leave Ukraine? Or stay? And then the university teachers decided, we'll set a good example. We'll bring the young people back into university life, help them feel normal again, and help them reconnect with reality.
Sich normal fühlen und wieder ankommen in der Realität. Das war gar nicht so einfach, sagt sie. Ist natürlich auch klar.
That wasn't easy at all, she says. And of course, that's understandable. Nobody wants to die. Even the Russians couldn't guarantee they'd be able to hold the area. We've seen it before. Around Kharkov and Kherson, the Russians pulled back and gave up territory again. So I also had, well, it was great actually. I had this little discussion round with some female students, and I asked them, so what are you? Russian? Ukrainian? And they all answered in unison, we're from Mariupol. That was, a kind of local patriotism. And they didn't want to be forced into that question of whether they were Russian or Ukrainian. I found that really likable. But especially we Germans should be able to understand that perfectly well.
Das doch eindeutig nachvollziehen können. Es war doch ein US-Präsident, der da stand.
It was a US president who stood there and made exactly that point, saying, I am a Berliner. That's exactly what this is about. People identify with their surroundings. They see themselves as part of their city, their region. A Bavarian knows he's a Bavarian, and you could say the same about Germans in general. So even if it doesn't always play out that way, you have to understand that people feel rooted in their region. And then to act as if all Ukrainians are one and the same, or all Russians are one and the same, that just doesn't reflect reality. But that's just part of the war narrative, unfortunately. Still, I'm glad there are journalists and correspondents like you, dear Ulrich, who can explain how things actually work, and now draw on real experience. That makes it all the more important that you can report on all of this. Just briefly before we wrap up, for people who want to support you, it's obviously not easy right now to find a way to help. But are there still any options? Maybe a place where people can donate, or something like that?
Ein Ort, an dem Leute spenden können oder ähnliches?
Also nach wie vor habe ich bei PayPal ein Konto.
So I still have a PayPal account, and right now, that's the only one I can list. I'd rather not use the Hamburg Savings Bank for transfers, because that could really be shut down soon. I'll have to come up with something else, but I haven't thought about it yet. The people who want to support this will probably, well, it doesn't depend on this particular day, so I'll figure something out.
Das Video hier wird auch erst in ein paar Tagen oder vielleicht.
This video will only go online in a few days, or maybe sometime next week. Until then, if you have anything, send it to me. I'll add it to the description of this video. I'll also include your PayPal account there. And to you, dear listeners, if you'd like to support Ulrich Heyden, please take a look at the description below this video. We definitely have to keep going. Reporting from the ground is incredibly important, so we can really understand what life is like and how the war is unfolding. Ulrich, is there anything you'd like to add? No? All right then. Ulrich Heyden, thank you for your time today.
Ulrich Heyden, danke für deine Zeit heute.
Ich bedanke mich auch.